Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
What does the Mamdani victory, the mayor-elect of New York City taking office at the beginning of January, mean for the United States and the world? This is a very important question, and almost a day does not go by that the mainstream media, as well as the independent press, independent online journals, and newspapers, do not have some kind of a story about Mamdani. The question, of course, with regard to the mainstream media, which fought very hard on behalf of Wall Street and the establishment Democratic Party and the Republican Party to defeat this progressive Democrat and to elect a discredited opponent, namely Mario Cuomo, is indicative of the bankruptcy of the political system in the United States that has evolved from Jeffersonian democracy to hybrid authoritarianism. And the reason for this, at the core of all this, is the combination of the political economy known as neoliberalism, adopted in the United States in its antecedent phase during the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter, but really institutionalized under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and continuing with both political parties supporting the neoliberal evolution of the political economy and phasing out over the last close to 50 years now, phasing out the Keynesian state, the social welfare state, and creating a corporate welfare state. At the core of the institutional crisis, both public and private sector crisis, right now in the United States is the bankruptcy of the neoliberal political economy that has led to hybrid authoritarianism, and it has never stopped to support continued forever war doctrine experiments to this day. This is what people voted against in New York City when they voted for, in November 2025, when they voted for Zoran Mamdani, an African born of Indian parents, Muslim, unapologetically embracing what he calls democratic socialism. We'll delve more into that. And what his opponents call communism. Just parenthetically, by the way, when Franklin Roosevelt won in 1932 and came to office in January 1933, the same year, the same month as Adolf Hitler, Roosevelt's opponents were calling him communist, socialist, a threat to capitalism. Although, in retrospect now, very few economists, respectful economists, not well paid by Wall Street firms, would disagree that because of FDR's New Deal, namely Keynesian economics, and the social safety net, the beginnings of the social welfare state, which continued during the Great Society of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, because of that, capitalism was saved from the from Wall Street, from the oligarchy, what Senator Bernie Sanders calls the oligarchy, and others as well, by the way, and from the Republican Party that had 3 successive presidents in the 1920s, and the result was the the crash of 29, leading to the Great Depression of the 1930s. So it is not surprising at all that there are those who claim that Zoran Mamdani is a communist. He is somehow a threat to capitalism, although when examining his agenda, it looks actually mild. I was going to say it does not look that different from what FDR was proposing. But what FDR was proposing in the 1930s was actually very radical. It was unprecedented. What Mamdani is proposing, it's actually very mild. It is within the system. Mamdani is a reformist, not a revolutionary. Revolution means systemic change. Change at the root of institutions, social change, political change. It means change that alters the division of labor. It means change. If he were a communist, he would suggest ending the private control of the means of production. He has never suggested that. This is all obviously vacuous rhetoric, because the institutional interest behind the neoliberal system and the forever war doctrine do not want to change course. They do not want to change course of hybrid authoritarianism that exists right now in the United States. They want to continue. And this in a city of 8.5 million people, where you have higher poverty levels in New York City than nationwide. Nationwide, it's around 12%. New York is around 14, 15%. Much higher rate of citizens, residents of New York City who cannot afford their own home. About 2/3 of the American people can and are homeowners. In New York, it's between 45 and 50%, somewhere in there. So much lower home ownership, depending, by the way, on whose statistics you accept. Mamdani remains, he hasn't taken office yet, he does in January 2026, a symbol of the failure of democracy in America. That's what he represents. Democracy identified with the neoliberal social contract and the forever war doctrine, and supporting genocide in Israel, despite the fact that most representatives of governments around the world at the UN General Assembly, at the UN Security Council, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, human rights organizations, all of them agree that genocide has been committed, including many Israeli organizations and individuals, including former Israeli government officials. And yet, Mamdani is the problem. Not all of these disasters, domestically and internationally. Now, the reaction to Mamdani at home is a reflection of the polarized America. On the one hand, those who want to stay the course of the disastrous neoliberal social contract and the forever war doctrine, okay, and supporting war or militarism, I should say, as a way of life, and giving more and more money to the Defense Department, now opening new fronts in the Caribbean and Latin America, targeting not just Venezuela, but the administration has openly stated that it has its eye on Colombia and even Mexico, neighboring Mexico. So what we have here is the establishment in crisis and panicking, and the mainstream media backing that establishment and essentially trying to indoctrinate the American people that the status quo is fine, although the residents, the voters of New York City, went to the polls and they voted against what the mainstream media represents, namely Wall Street, the military industrial complex, and the bankrupt two-party system. Mamdani has been greeted with fear mongering, and despite millionaires and billionaires, including, by the way, many connected with the Jewish lobby in New York City, pouring tens of millions to defeat him, okay, because he represents the dual threat of condemning, he has the audacity of condemning genocide. Imagine that the opposite of that is being an apologist of genocide. Imagine the moral depravity of such a position, to be at the level where one criticizes an opponent who is against genocide. This is unheard of. At the same time, what we have in New York City is a city, like I said, of 8.5 million people, where the statistics indicate the majority of the population owns the minority of the capital, of the wealth. And the minority, the top 5% in this city, what Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others call the oligarchy in this city, the financial capital of the world since the 1920s, by the way, this minority population owns most of the wealth. And they want to determine the fate of 8.5 million people, despite the fact that a vast majority of them cannot make ends meet. They live from paycheck to paycheck. There is a high poverty level. There is an issue of unaffordability of rental. When you look at the national statistics of the average rent in the United States versus New York City, you will not be surprised that New York ranks among the highest in the nation, along with cities in Hawaii, in Honolulu, in San Francisco, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., by the way. So what you have here is an establishment that insists that let's take a teacher who is needed, who teaches the children even of these wealthy people. That teacher who must work in New York City, where the jobs are, to teach the children of, including the rich, can't afford to live in New York City. Many New Yorkers work in New York and live in Pennsylvania and New Jersey because they can't afford New York. So as Mamdani, by the way, correctly pointed out, so you have a city that's unaffordable. Transportation is unaffordable. Housing is unaffordable. Healthcare, more unaffordable than anything, by the way. College tuition, unaffordable. Child healthcare, unaffordable. All of these things, the neoliberal oligarchy and its apologists in the media call socialism and communism. It can't be done. We can't put money to fund social welfare programs. They were saying the same thing, by the way, about Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s when he began to introduce a number of social safety net programs during the Great Depression, including Social Security. Exactly the same thing. No one in the right mind today, although there are people, by the way. So I was going to say, no one in the right mind would suggest eliminating Social Security. They do, neoliberals do, and have suggested privatizing it, putting that money into the stock market, high risk for the elderly. Even even balanced analysts, Wall Street analysts, do not suggest that the older a person gets, the more they risk they ought to take in the stock market. They just the less risk, the less risk. Life expectancy is not that long for them. So the insanity for capital accumulation to raise profits at the expense of the general population, this madness, it borders on sociopathic behavior. And someone comes along and suggests, well, let's take a look at the expenses on transportation, housing, childcare, healthcare. Let's take a look at these things. Let's see if we can do something about it. Immediately, he's a communist. There's no money for it. However, there is money to bail out billionaires who have stock in banks, insurance companies, and other corporations. And there is money for subsidies, for corporate subsidies, where the billionaires and the millionaires have investments. There's money for that, but there's no money to support the poor, to support the working class. There is no money to raise wages, although CEOs of corporations make 500 times more than the average worker. There's money for that. No one is outraged that Elon Musk asked for outrageous amounts of money in compensation as the CEO of Tesla, but no one is outraged that a worker, a factory worker, or a warehouse worker, or a cleaning lady in a hotel cannot afford to live in New York City. No one is out. And when Mamdani suggests, well, let's do something about the minimum wage. Oh, no. Can't afford that. But we can afford millions in compensation for CEOs. That is affordable. Helping the working class to have a chance at the American dream, as Mamdani pointed out, that's not affordable. It is interesting that on 21 November 2025, on the day that the mayor-elect visited the president, at the mayor-elect's request, by the way, and he was very deferential to the president. And the president was actually very cordial to him. On that day, the House, both Democrats and Republicans, chose to vote, this is symbolic, on a resolution that states that socialism is a threat to the nation. That socialism is horrible. It's a horror. Although there is no socialism in the United States, there is corporate welfare. There is no socialism. The interesting thing is that 86 Democrats joined the Republicans, to give you how bankrupt the so-called fossilized politicians, as many in the mainstream media call them, progressive media call them. 86 Democrats, and I believe two abstained from the vote, which really gave a vote to the majority. The vast majority of the members, all the Republicans and 86 Democrats plus 2 abstaining, voted to condemn the horrors of socialism, as though socialism exists in the United States. It's like voting to fight alien beings from Jupiter. We don't have any. There is no socialism in the United States. What there is are the remnants of the Keynesian state, of the social welfare state, from the FDR period to the Great Society of LB, started with John Kennedy, of course, and Johnson continued along those lines, because he had the Vietnam War, the so-called combination of social welfare to appease the American people because of the Vietnam War, because he wanted their support for the Vietnam War. Now, so this is what they condemned, to send a message to America that the mainstream, the bankrupt mainstream political parties want to stay the course of corporate welfare and militarism. That they have money for. Corporate subsidies, there's money for. Taxpayer money, by the way. For the defense sector, $1 trillion defense budget next year. That there is money for. To feed children in schools, hungry children in schools, there's no money for that. No, there's no money. To raise the minimum wage to a livable wage. There's a difference between minimum wage and livable wage according to the US Department of Labor. When you look at labor statistics, as well as AFL-CIO statistics, by the way, what you find is that there's a huge difference, especially in cities like New York, San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C., in cities in Hawaii. The minimum wage does not suffice for an individual or a family to survive on those wages. It is way below what it takes. Now, Mamdani's so-called the self-identity with democratic socialism, by the way, is not as radical as it might seem. And no matter what the mainstream media and critics of Mamdani say, the fact is there are mayors, just two of the major cities, where there are progressive Democrats who are not that different at all from Mamdani. Boston and Chicago, for example. There are other cities, but these are the two major ones. And historically, since the 19th century, there have been progressive mayors. And indeed, the progressive movement at the turn of the century, from the period of Theodore Roosevelt to Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, President Wilson, these are Woodrow Wilson, these are the three presidents of the progressive era from 1900 to 1920. So, however, they became progressive presidents because at the local level, then at the state level, there was a progressive movement with Wisconsin, among other Midwestern states, as well as some in the New England area, started this. And this is what is happening today. We see this in New York, in New England, in the Midwest, with the rise, Portland, Oregon, by the way, there are others, with the rise of progressivism at the local level, and it's people are getting the message. And when we look at statistics, by the way, 65% of the Democrats registered voters do not see anything unusual, anything wrong with Mamdani declaring himself a democratic socialist, a social democrat in essence. In other words, an FDR, what he is he's no different than Bernie Sanders in that respect, who calls himself a socialist. Bernie Sanders is a New Deal Democrat. There have always, those who have studied American history, by the way, should know this, there have always been, from the 1940s, from the time Roosevelt died and Truman took over and veered the Democratic Party to the right, there has always been a strain within the Democratic Party from Truman to the present. It's a minority strain, but it's the FDR strain, the New Deal strain. And there have been politicians who have embraced that agenda and all along rejected the agenda of succumbing to the orthodoxy of Wall Street, and since the late 1970s, especially 1980s, the orthodoxy of the neoliberal corporate welfare state at the expense of the social welfare state, taking the money out of the social welfare state, taxpayer money, by the way. This does not belong to the billionaires of Wall Street. They're not in the business of giving anything. They're in the business of taking, and that's how they become billionaires. So, and transferring that money there, and both political parties, the government, no matter which party is in office in the last 45 years, from Reagan to the present, has been using the fiscal system, that is the tax system, to enrich the richest and to impoverish the bottom 2/3 of the population. And Mamdani comes along and says, can we have 2% of a rise in taxes of those who make $1 million or more to fund some of these programs? And immediately there is an outcry. Oh, if you do that, they're going to go to Florida. Let them go to Florida. Let them. They did not do that in Chicago and in Boston. This is not how capitalism works. People don't, the wealthy elites do not get up and leave because they will get up and leave and relocate factories and relocate central offices and relocate warehouses and so forth if they receive corporate subsidies, if they receive tax breaks. That they will do, by the way. Okay? But imposing a 2% so that their workers can afford to work for them in that state is not an absurdity. It is a necessity, and it's the very least. Someone working within the system. This is not a revolutionary. Mamdani, I repeat, is not a revolutionary. He's a reformist. He's a Roosevelt, he's an FDR reformist. He's working within the system. When he met with Trump, Trump had no problem with him. And it is not the nonsense that the media portrayed. Oh, Mamdani is charming. He smiles. And Trump was so enslaved by the Mamdani smile. No, it's because Trump knows the institutional structure that exists out there of the neoliberal social contract is the one that Mamdani will work within, not to overthrow it, but he will go within it to secure some crumbs. As the great Canadian-American historian, economic historian and economist John Kenneth Galbraith used to say during the genesis of neoliberalism back in the 1980s, these crumbs that fall from the horse's mouth, the horse being the rich, and the sparrows, John Kenneth Galbraith's analogy, are picking up whatever the horse spills over. That's all Mamdani is doing. He is not shattering the capitalist world system by any means. He can't do that even if he wanted to. He comes into office, he hasn't taken office, he comes into office in an existing institutional structure, political, social, economic, and he has to work within it. And all he's doing, is trying to get some concessions for workers, for the poor, so that the city can function much better and have a sense of hope for the bottom 2/3 of the population in New York City. And one of the reasons that even billionaires who opposed him and had given money to Cuomo to defeat Mamdani, by the way, and even Trump, we had called for his return, called for throwing him out of the country, depriving him of his citizenship. Mamdani has been here since he was very young. He grew up in New York, in Queens, New York. Even Trump said, "Well, I'll see what I can do. I'll work with you." And so did Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan, some other billionaires, many of them who had actually opposed him, adamantly opposed him, and were financing his opponent. So, well, if there's something we can do, work within the system, because they recognize that's the mayor. The appointees he has, by the way, are appointees that have worked for previous administrations or other bureaucracies. They did not come from Moscow, from the Kremlin, or from Beijing, from Xi Jinping's government. They came from New York. They're New Yorkers. They came from the institution, the public institutional structure, and the reformers, and he's putting them in there to see if he can get some crumbs, to go back to Kenneth Galbraith's analogy, some crumbs for the bottom two-thirds of the population. So they do not feel completely alienated, so that the city, so that at least he gives them a sense of hope, the delusion that indeed the American dream is reachable, although it will not be, as much as I like Mamdani. I don't think he has the ability to reverse the course of the neoliberal disaster. The neoliberal system is in crisis as much in the United States as reflected in the hybrid authoritarian system which exists now in the US, by the way, with troops, ICE and National Guard and so forth in major cities, and increasing that presence with major announcements just recently, right during and after Thanksgiving, against the entire global South, not just the one Muslim, the Afghan who shot the two National Guards, the tragedy of those individuals, and that is indeed a tragedy that should be condemned. Not just that one isolated incident, but the entire global, not just Muslims from Afghanistan. At first, it was just Afghanistan, but everybody, not just Muslims, period, the entire global South, which, by the way, just for the record, is the vast majority of the world's population. 8 billion people, the majority is the global South. In any case, the point here is that Mamdani, the reaction of Mamdani is a polarized reaction in America. There are those who are from enthusiastic, at last there is hope amid a hybrid authoritarian system and a political economy that is for the rich. They can afford housing. They can afford college tuition for their children. They can afford childcare. They are the ones that have a sense of real freedom, as Mamdani pointed in his acceptance speech, and even before he pointed that out. Real freedom is for them who can afford it. What about the rest of the citizens of the United States? Outside, marginalized. And on top of that, those in the name of hunting down undocumented workers, the class warfare intensifying. And Mamdani has stated very plainly, he's against continuing to support any regime that continues the class warfare in America, using the Latinos as a pretext to declare war on the working class, which has been declared, by the way, going back to the Reagan era, and it continues. Some would argue, and I would disagree with that, it starts with Carter in a sort of a cautious way, but it really accelerates with Reagan, and it hasn't stopped. That class warfare, which is the mark of the neoliberal social contract, even Warren Buffett, to his credit, at one point said, it's not the working class that declared war on us, the billionaire class, in other words, the oligarchy. We declared war on them. The fact is that the capitalist class is the one that has been absorbing. When you look at statistics, when you look at what has happened to transfer of income and wealth in the last 50 years in America, what you see is a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom up. Stagnation of wages amid rising cost of living. So living standards for the bottom two-thirds drops. While for the first time, we have people, the richest 1%, if you like, but as many point out, but really the 5% owning more wealth than the bottom 3/4 of the population of America. The question here is a practical one. Besides this psychopathic greed, which leads to such destructiveness in society, there is another dimension here. Can a society survive like this? The answer of capitalists, of course it can. Use artificial intelligence, use machines, displace workers. And at least some analysts and some artificial intelligence tech people, experts, are pointing out that in the absence of displacing workers with these machines, you can't make, these companies cannot become multi-trillion-dollar companies. The only reason that NVIDIA, among others, are so rich in valuation is because investors are expecting the machine to replace the worker. From federal government to state government to local government to the private sector, everywhere. What kind of a society is it? This is a dystopian view of society. What do you do? This is the sort of thing you read in novels and you see in movies, where the rich live somewhere in the sky and the rest of the population are looking for scrap metal to sell so they can eat for the day. This is an extreme example, but this is the situation where society is headed. And Mamdani comes along and says, no, that's not the kind of society we want. That is not democracy. I want to turn over to the next, because this is a reaction, as I said at the outset, as I stated at the outset, of Mamdani at home, which is really mostly from the mainstream media, which is trying to indoctrinate the majority of the population. The minority of the population is not buying it, by the way. Very negative. There is, however, for the minority of the population, the progressive Democrats who stayed home, did not vote for Kamala Harris, and that's how Trump got in, by the way. The reason Trump got in is because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party did not go to vote. So Trump gets in. Now Mamdani comes along and stimulates a sort of a enthusiasm, not just for New York City, but for the whole country. And it is not the case, by the way, as the mainstream media points out, that Mamdani is, and his influence is limited to New York. It's not. It is a nationwide influence here, because all of the nation was waiting to see what would happen on that day in November. And what happened on that day in November, Democrats, especially progressives, from New York to California, actually, the Democratic Party got a boost out of the Mamdani situation. Why? It's not because of his smile. It has nothing to do with it. It's because of what he said. The message rings true. And the message is the majority of the American people cannot afford to live in their own country, in their own cities, in their own neighborhoods, because capital concentration has gotten to the point of pricing them out of their own country. So the American dream is dead, has been dead. And all he's saying is, can we inject some life into the American dream? A sense of hope, even as false as it may be, so that they can stand on their feet at least. Transportation, childcare, school lunches, rent, that sort of thing. Minor things that would mean nothing to millionaires and billionaires, that 2% he's suggesting. Now, let's look at the global reaction. The global reaction, I live in Europe, and here in Europe, the European reaction to Mamdani in much of the centrist and the progressive press was very favorable, because they had a sense of hopelessness about the United States. Where was it going? There was no end. And of course, the centrists and leftists and progressives in Europe felt sort of betrayed because of the tariffs that Trump was imposing and the increasingly authoritarian tone and promising in rhetoric, of course, insisting that he's the peace president, but yet wars continue, including the so-called Gaza peace, which isn't, there hasn't been any peace. So when Mamdani scored that victory, and actually Democrats all over the United States did, the reaction here was very interesting. It was, well, maybe all is not lost. Maybe New Deal Democrats like Mamdani have a chance. The other thing that was interesting is from up there in Norway all the way down to the Balkans was that center leftist parties and leftist parties got a sense of, well, a sense of optimism, if you will, that Mamdani won. They figured, well, not bad. Maybe we have a chance. Maybe we can approach the situation of of the crisis of neoliberalism, which is global, by the way. The crisis of neoliberalism, capitalism is a world system. It always has been. It's not confined to the city of New York or any city in the world. And it's not confined to any nation. It's a global system. It always has been. Capitalism is international. So they figured, well, let's approach it from that angle, and maybe that will register with voters and they can get into office and pursue and bring back, strengthen somewhat the social welfare state, which has been in retreat throughout Europe, by the way, as well as the rest of the world. Okay, Argentina is a very good example, a very bad example, where there is a retreat of the social welfare state at the expense of the Argentinian workers and the middle class under Javier Milei. So what happened is that there was, by them, an enthusiastic reaction. Even more important, many Europeans could not understand why the right, especially in the United States, were portraying Mamdani's agenda, his platform on which he ran, as socialist and communist, because the Europeans have even more radical social welfare programs than the ones Mamdani is proposing. So the reaction was, wait a minute, we have that and more. And so for the Europeans, it was absurd because they live in democratic societies, and the social safety net, which Mamdani is trying to repair, by the way, he's not trying to do anything radical. He's trying to repair a broken social safety net. The Europeans take this for granted. A lot of the things he's proposing, they take for granted because they have them. Okay, especially Northwest Europe and especially the Scandinavian countries. Okay, so the left, the progressives, the center left were encouraged by what Mamdani was doing, and they did not see what is so communist, or obviously this is the term communism. Those who have studied communism and the varieties of socialism, because there's not one variety but many varieties of socialism throughout history, know this is all nonsense, that Mamdani is in essence, in terms of policy proposals, a Keynesian Democrat. That's all he is. He can claim himself democratic socialist, that's fine. Democratic socialist is, in fact, when you look by the policy proposals, Keynesianism. John Maynard Keynes, who advised President Roosevelt, FDR, among others around the world, okay, proposed stuff like this. And others who followed Keynes, John Kenneth Galbraith, the same thing, okay? Now, the question, of course, becomes, what is the future of the progressive movement at the local level as Mamdani represents it? It is true that at this was a grassroots movement, and it succeeded. And I have seen many interviews of Mamdani. In one interview, I believe it was CNN reporter who asked, "What about endorsements? What about endorsements?" This is before he won or after he won. Actually, it was after he won. And he said, "Well, didn't this election prove that endorsements by billionaires and multimillionaires and mainstream politicians don't mean anything because I won? He won." So the so-called endorsements by the establishment, political figures, and by establishment, obviously the Wall Street figures and the institutional establishment people, they didn't mean anything because the people defied them. When the people defy the elites, that is indication that the social contract is not working. This is not, by the way, according to me, the father of Western liberalism, John Locke, in the 17th century, in his political philosophy, pointed this out, that how do the people know when their government is one of tyranny, according to Locke? They know because it impacts their lives, and they decide that the system is tyrannical and get rid of it. In this case, they didn't get rid of it through any violent means. They simply went to the polls and voted someone who is against the neoliberal social contract and militarism, someone who does not defend genocide. 1/3 of the Jewish population in New York voted for Mamdani. Does this mean that they're anti-Semitic? 1/3 of the Jews in New York? No, it means that they agree that genocide is wrong, morally and politically, in any shape or form. It's indefensible. If it was wrong for the Armenians, wrong for the Jews in under Holocaust, the Armenians, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews, the Third Reich, it's wrong. What happened in Gaza? It's not you can't defend it. And to label someone anti-Semitic because they are against genocide and against the apartheid state is indefensible politically and morally. I want to be optimistic about what is coming up for Mayor-elect Mamdani. However, there are two fears, and there has been some literature written on this. There's been some literature on this. One is the fear of co-optation. Will Mamdani be co-opted, brought into the mainstream of the establishment, make one compromise after the other, dilute his agenda to the degree, his social welfare agenda, to the degree that he becomes a neoliberal light? Will Mamdani become neoliberal light? That's one issue, and there have been scholars who have written on this. That's one possibility. We don't know. He hasn't taken over yet. Another possibility is that at every turn there will be opposition from the city council. Already Wall Street is behind city council members to oppose anything Mamdani does at every step of the way, to sabotage him, to undermine him, so nothing gets through city council. Then the same billionaires and lobbies in upstate New York at the State House are also trying to make sure nothing gets through, and there is no cooperation between the governor's office and the state legislature supporting down here, supporting New York City under Mamdani. So they can sabotage him from the local level, the state level, and then there's the federal government. Now, President Trump, to his credit, behaved well, and he was very cordial very professional, very cordial, and pledged that he, after all, he's a New Yorker, and he pledged, yes, I'll try to do what I can for New York City. The question is, for whom in New York City? For the billionaire class, the multimillionaire class, as Senator Bernie Sanders says, or for all New Yorkers, without exception? Will the president support Mamdani? Now, Mayor LaGuardia in the 1930s, he had the support of Franklin Roosevelt. Mayor LaGuardia was a mayor who brought in about very important changes amid the Great Depression to support the people of New York, to make it through in this very important city in the United States, the financial capital to the world. LaGuardia was lucky because he had Roosevelt behind him, and Roosevelt was committed to the agenda. The question is, does Mamdani will he have any kind of support other than the nice rhetoric? And of course, it was, like I said, the meeting, you have to give credit where credit is. The meeting went very well. Nothing, no argument. It wasn't a type of meeting as we have seen the president conduct in the Oval Office toward Zelensky, the first meeting toward Zelensky, or toward the South African president Ramaphosa. Those were confrontational. They were very bad meetings, very, very awkward to watch, even for the viewer. That's not the kind of meeting. It was very cordial. And there was, in rhetoric, the support that the president will support some modest changes so people in New York can make a living, go on living. That's all they want. They just want to work and make a living in the city they live, instead of going over to New Jersey or Pennsylvania, anywhere in Pennsylvania, and then commute back and forth, and go back and forth to work, an hour, 2 hours actually, to New York. I am cautiously optimistic that some things will get through. Some things will get through. I think reality will sink in even on the sociopathic, greedy individuals who want, whose multi-millions are not enough. They want, or billions are not enough. They want even more. I think that the reality will sink in, that society that has to have some sense of equilibrium, just as there must be equilibrium in the marketplace so that it can function harmoniously. There has to be social equilibrium. In the absence of social equilibrium, there will be chaos in New York. And if Mamdani fails, the failure of the Mamdani social welfare reform movement and a grassroots movement may, I don't know, it may create an underground movement that's not about reform, but about systemic change, revolution. So it is really in the interest of Wall Street, in the interest of the mainstream political parties, in the interest of the state legislature, in the interest of the city council in New York City, to work to get some of these things done, to make the city affordable. No one has any illusions that it is not affordable. It is a very expensive city to live in. You need a lot of money to live in New York. And the reality is that it is universally known, but the financial elites, the corporate elites in New York, backed by the two political parties, the establishment parties, don't want to make any changes, oblivious to reality of how a city ought to function, oblivious to it. We will see what is in store for Mamdani. One hopes that he makes it. It will send a strong message, if he does make it, to the rest of the country and to the world. This is exactly what the neoliberal establishment doesn't want. And one of the reasons I'm not optimistic is because I believe They want him to fail. They want him to fail because it will send a signal that this is the path, this is the correct path. Just like the elites in the 1930s, opposed to Franklin Roosevelt, wanted him to fail because they didn't want the establishment of a social welfare state, that he laid the foundations for it, by the way. Not that it was anything radical. It was socialism. It was a Keynesian state with social welfare safety net, so that society can function, people can get through the depression. I thank you for tuning in. I thank you for watching. I thank you for sending comments. Please send comments, questions, and by all means, do join this channel. This is an educational channel. Thank you very much. Thank you.